Good morning. I'm going to today talk about the 8-stage learning design framework, which is a piece of scholarship that I've been developing for over a decade, and it's now kind of coming into a form that I'm happy to share. There'll be a monograph on this hopefully in the next 18 months. The 8-stage learning design framework is essentially a structure that supports learning design teams rather than specific individuals. It designs a team framework to design courses and programs in higher education. So there are 8 stages. There's effectively a sort of a stage 0, which is the overview, where institutions will orientate themselves to the learning design process. They understand their institutional purpose and so on. But we're going to start with stage 1. Stage 1 is student profiles. Stage 2 is contexts. Stage 3 is media choices. Stage 4 is intended learning outcomes. Stage 5 is assessment. Stage 6 is learning design activities, learning and teaching activities. Stage 7 is feedback, and stage 8 is evaluation. So I'm going to go through each one with a little bit of detail, although there's a lot more detail online. So stage 1 is student profiles. Now, the notion of profiling sounds rather ominous, but effectively what it allows you to do as a design team is to imagine what different types of students might take your program or your module at the extreme. So you want to think about the most extreme students, triangulate the kind of students that will embark on your program. And that means thinking about who the oldest student would be, who would be the youngest student would be, who the most experienced would be, the most qualified, the least qualified. So you want to sort of think about what your boundaries are effectively, in order to make sure that what you then subsequently develop is suitable for at least the vast majority and hopefully everyone that will embark on your program. If you get that right, you improve your overall retention and your overall student success. So you draw those sketches effectively of those students. I would suggest doing 3-4 different student sketches, and you keep them visible through the design process so that all subsequent stages then reflect back as to will student A, will student B, will student C find that helpful, useful, informative, and so on. So it's stage 1, student profiling. Once you've established who your students are likely to be, or might be, or could be, you then need to think about the contexts, discipline and professional context that you're designing for. So disciplines change over time. The themes in disciplines change, the focus changes, and professions are certainly evolving very, very quickly. The reality, of course, is that most students go to do a particular degree, even if it's a professional degree, will come out into a professional environment that's very different to the one that they started, if it's a 3-year degree or 3 or 4 year degree. So designing those contexts is very important, and that involves thinking about what professional standards statements are, what ethical standards, whatever the trends, the employment trends are. So there's a real emphasis in this stage on horizon scanning. That then, once you've established that, so you know who your students are, you know the environment that they're likely to be working in, or the kind of what you're teaching them for, then you've got to think about the best media to embark on that learning journey. Now, the media involves not just the transmission, the communication process, the virtual learning environments and the videos and the audio and the podcasts and the readings. It's also thinking about the actual structures of the learning. So thinking about what existing content is available, thinking about reusing existing content, taking external third-party content and repurposing it and so on. So a review of the media will also then tell you whether it's suitable for the student. If, for example, you decide that a fair proportion of your students would be working in very remote environments, delivering your media using a high speed broadband is clearly not going to be particularly sensible. So thinking about matching your students and your context to your media is also very important. So those are the first 3 foundational stages. We then go into a loop of 3 stages, which are all very informative of each other. It's an iterative process, effectively. So these are, just to remind you, stage 4 is intended learning outcomes, stage 5 is assessment, stage 6 is learning and teaching activities. Those 3 are the core of constructive alignment, and I'll talk about constructive alignment in another video. But essentially, you need to design each stage and tweak each stage as you go through. So it's a process of reinforcing each other. So stage 4 is intended learning outcomes. I'm a big proponent of intended learning outcomes. I know not everybody is. I think they are the backbone of an effective and robust design. I think without them, your design is very easily unstable, and it only takes a minor environmental contextual disruption to destroy an erstwhile good program. So having really sound intended learning outcomes is important, and I have, in other videos, I've suggested you really need to design those outcomes across all 5 domains of learning. So the cognitive domain, the metacognitive, the affective, the psychomotor, and the interpersonal, to make sure that you do have a genuinely broad and meaningful educational program for students. So you draft your outcomes, which tells you what students are going to do with the learning. You know who the students are, you know the context, you know the media, you now work out what you want students to do with the learning. At this point, you're not defining content. That's very important. You're not defining the content, you're defining what they're going to learn in terms of what they can do with the learning. You then design the assessment. You draft the assessment design in the next stage, stage 5, in order to make sure that you can provide sufficient opportunities for students to evidence their attainment of those outcomes. And then you start to draft, to design the learning activities. Now, we're not talking here about the specific activities topic by topic or session by session. You're talking about more the activity strategies, effectively. So if, for example, your outcomes require a great deal of real-world practical engagement, say you're an architect and you need to get students to actively design some social care facility, for example, you're going to assess that presumably by setting up a project where they do that, and you then assess that project work. Then the learning and teaching activities, there's no point in looking at Gothic architecture. You're clearly going to design activities that are relevant to the particular outcome. So I think about activities as almost rehearsals for the outcomes. So you've drafted outcomes, you've drafted assessment, you draft activities. As you design activities, you come across a fantastic idea, a real world opportunity, an industry related activity, and you think, okay, I'm not going to be able to run that, and that's a really key element of the program. I'm going to have to tweak my outcome, I'm going to tweak my assessment, and so that loop, if you like, takes into operation. I hope you can still hear me. I'm going to put my microphone back in. So effectively, that's a process, an iterative process for designing those 3 things all together. You then take the 4th part of that learning process, which is feedback. I'm a big proponent of feedback throughout, so to try and convey to the students that your feedback is not on a final piece of work or only on written pieces of work, but that feedback is a completely ingrained process of the learning. So feedback throughout sometimes is effectively synonymous with formative assessment, which is a concept most people understand. So I think of feedback throughout as being very much integrated into the learning activity. So as you design activities, you think about, okay, how am I going to feed back on students' engagement with that activity. And then the final stage 8, is evaluation. And you should never leave evaluation to the very end of a program or module. You should always integrate it into the process, because effectively you're evaluating the effectiveness of each stage. So that's a very, very quick overview of what is normally delivered in a week's workshop. There's a 2-day residential version, which I also run. And there are individual workshops for each individual stages, but effectively, and as I say, there will be a monograph. There is some there are some resources available online at scigen.com, but it's something that I feel is very important to curate the process, and the monograph will support other colleagues to be able to run the program, the framework, with their colleagues in their own institutions. But essentially, it's a very comprehensive framework that allows you to design very robust programs. And the important thing is that each stage builds on the former stage, but also, equally importantly, they are all in draft right until the end. It's a very iterative process. So I hope you found that interesting. Please access the resources on the web and ask any questions.